Okay, easy. Okay, so as I've been introduced, my name is Reuben. I'm a founder of the business called Smudge. We're based in Christchurch. We started here a few years ago. There have been a lot of great speakers on today, so I just want to thank you for actually coming to this one and coming to hear what I have to say. When we started building apps just over 5 years ago, the smartphone world was a really different place. When you think back, using your finger to control a phone was pretty unheard of, and keyboards ruled the day. And a 320 by 160 screen was actually considered high res. Today I really wanted to take 20 minutes to reflect on the rapid change that we've seen over these last few years and put like a little bit of a developer's twist on it. First I want to tell you how we began building apps and just extend on that story a little bit more so you can see the angle my point of view is shaped by. And then I'm going to look at iOS and Android and show you why I believe that Google doesn't actually care who wins this war of mobile losses. When we started Smudge, a few of our peers saw the iPhone for what it was, which is a personal mobile computer. And they started building first software as if everybody else in the market saw it like that as well. But we saw it a little differently and thought that most people, when they got their first iPhone, would want to have cool apps to show off their friends. In that vein, we began building a whole bunch of different apps, with the main requirement that if we couldn't build it in a weekend, that we wouldn't bother. The strategy worked pretty well for us, and about 6 months following that, we created an app that became the #1 free app on the US App Store charts. The app, as mentioned, was called Sound Grenade, which was designed to annoy people by playing a really high-pitched sound. As Reuben said, it had about 200,000 downloads in a day in its peak, and we monetized the app with both ads and in-app purchases. And we still actually get regular downloads of this today. If only my piano professor from university could have seen me now. I've gone from using my skills as a musician to making pleasing sounds to creating one of the literally the most annoying sound apps in America. I used the funds from Sound Grenade to buy a house and decided to take this full time. Where to start? We'd made another soundboard app called Farmyard. You can sort of see a little bit of a theme here. And even though the lions sounded like giraffes, kids loved the bright colours and could be entertained for at least 10 minutes on demand, and that made the parents pretty happy. One of the parents happened to be the digital director at Yellow Pages, who contacted us about making an app for them. Being just out of university, not exactly sure what that meant, we said we'd give it a go. And learning as we went about software development, we made a location-aware search app for Yellow that used their data in a way that hadn't been used up until that point. The app quickly became one of the top downloaded apps in New Zealand, and then we continued on to build the apps for companies that were mentioned before, like Vodafone, Flix, Fairfax, Frucor and Sky. Our focus is on making native apps using first-party tools, and that's across any modern smartphone platform. So we're really early Android adopters and early Windows Phone adopters, and have used and developed for probably almost any of the mainstream devices on the market and the modern smartphone OSs. If you are interested in learning any more about the apps that we've built, you can go to our website, which is a good starting point. I'm more than happy to try to answer any specific questions about any apps afterwards. To understand where Android and iOS are at today, I think one of the best places is to look where they both came from. Choosing where to start a history of the modern smartphone OS is actually surprisingly difficult. With iOS, you start from the origins of NextStep, company that Apple Computer purchased, which became OS X, and what the majority of foundational classes within iOS are named after, such as NSString and NSArray. Well, with Android, given how closely Andy Reuben, the founder of Android Inc., that was later sold to Google, has been associated with the platform, you start with his background in education or the previous companies that he founded. I decided that, considering I included the word brief in my pitch to get you to come along, I'm going to start from when Steve Jobs announced the iPhone in January 2007 and when Google launched the G1 in October 2008. When the iPhone was first introduced, it got a lot of attention for a huge number of reasons. One of the first ones was, wow, Apple's building a cell phone, which everyone was hoping for a little while. Must be pretty cool, but is it actually going to be useful? Some of the attention was focused on features the device didn't have, which were quite a few. And there are a handful of legacy smartphone OS manufacturers, including Windows Mobile, Palm OS, Symbian and BlackBerry, that all had a lot more features than the iPhone. In comparison to those devices, the iPhone didn't have 3G, no multitasking, let alone third-party apps, didn't have a user-visible file system, so you couldn't do anything with files, and you still can't. And you couldn't even change anything on the home screen. I don't know how many people remember this, but you couldn't change anything on the home screen at all, apart from the wallpaper. And as crazy as it sounds, but even without any of these features the competitors had, Apple had made a device that actually did some things really, really well. And the device stood out from the crowd by eschewing the stylus or a hardware keyboard, but instead focused on responding to direct finger input in a way that no one had seen before on the personal device. In this first version, Apple had perfected features like pinch to zoom and inertial scrolling, and it made the device feel pretty much unlike anything else to use. Other features that the iPhone did like nothing else were built-in iPod, web browser, easy-to-use phone address book, and the ability to sync with iTunes, which was software that millions and millions of customers had invested putting their music libraries into. Looking back on this today, it's interesting to note the things that have lasted the time and things that didn't. For a start, Apple didn't get the pricing right from the get-go and dropped $200 off the phone in the first few months of putting it on sale. But aside from hiccups like this in its first year, I think it's actually more interesting what people did with the device that Apple didn't do. It wasn't long until the device was jailbroken, or what we now call jailbroken, and this meant that people do a range of things that Apple hadn't planned on, including creating apps. And there's a basic jailbreak market in those first 12 months, and there's thousands of apps on that alone, from band-in-a-box type apps to basic games and remote screen sharing. Apple updated the OS a couple of times during the year, adding the iTunes Music Store and ability to save web pages, links to the home screen, and reorder where the icons were. And this was literally jaw-breaking at the time. People were like, yes, I can put Mail app at the top of my screen now. And thinking about this today, this sounds pretty backwards, but it was actually met with quite a bit of enthusiasm from people at the time. The next biggest change for iOS was the introduction of the App Store in July 2008. I think this was where there's a real radical shift for an operating system marketed for consumers, where it was so easy to download and pay for apps, and customers took to them really well. A few months after this, Google launched their first Android product, T-Mobile G1, and they always had some better features in the iPhone and other areas where it was lacking. I don't know how many people used G1, but with the first release of Android, there wasn't even an on-screen keyboard or multi-touch. I remember using it that anytime you wanted to send a message, you'd have to rotate the device into landscape and then scroll the keyboard up to actually write a message. What it did have, though, was a universal notification system, which is largely unchanged and is now actually the standard way that most platforms do that. They also had home screen widgets, and like the first version of iOS, they weren't actually able to be developed for by third-party developers. The first update came with Android 1.1, and Google proved with this release that they can do over-the-air updates very easily, which was really, really forward-thinking at the time, and it's kind of disappointing to look back on now, given how comparatively few Android users are actually running an up-to-date OS. Google's first release with their dessert-based names was Cupcake, and that was launched with an on-screen keyboard. But I believe one of the most significant releases for Google was Donut with 1.6. And Donut was the release that Google added resolution independence into the OS, which has had a profound effect on the phones and apps that are in production today. Since these first releases, both OSs have had a wide variety of user features to their OSs, and I'm not going to go through all those today because we'd be here for hours. But instead, I just want to focus on some of the changes under the hood for developers. I've tried to be as unbiased as possible, and this is kind of why I've written it out, so I don't sort of go on a rant about some different things. And I know that lots of users have really strong preferences for either Android or iOS. So for my research, I went through literally all the developer release notes for both platforms and discussed internally with our teams of iOS and Android developers. And based on this research and our experience of building Android apps, noting that we don't build games, there's really been pretty minimal change for Android apps since version 2, which is 4 years ago. Android 2 did include a number of developer features that still aren't on iOS, like they introduced the SIP-based internet telephony stack and NFC, things I haven't really seen used many places. And they did improve the runtime with a new garbage collector that sped up memory management a little bit. They also did things like open up access for the download manager. Android 3.0 was only for tablets, but it did bring some changes that we actually use day-to-day in development, which is activity fragments. And they basically make it easier to create a UI with multiple activities. 4.0 brought some of these features back onto the phone and had a new look for the system. But despite all the user-specific changes over these few releases, there are not a dramatic difference in the APIs that you actually use. They did add some things like, for example, calendar access and access to user features like the beam feature. They didn't really change that much how an app was written unless you're using those specific features. The rest of the 4 versions added a few new features, including clear focus on performance, and made a range of improvements to existing APIs. But as I said, there hasn't been a lot that's changed. So effectively what that means, and based on the number of users on the latest versions, is mostly when we're developing apps, we develop for Android 2.3, which is now a 3-year-old OS. I want to contrast this with iOS, where there have been some significant changes as a developer. And probably one of the biggest of these is the way that memory is handled. In early releases of iOS, the only way to manage memory was manually with reference counting. Apple did have garbage collection implemented in OS X, but for performance reasons, they made the decision not to take that approach on iOS. Instead, with the release of iOS 5 towards the end of 2011, Apple made enhancements to the compiler, where it actually handled the retain release cycle for you as a developer if you followed some specific conventions. And this brought the performance benefits of manual memory management and the architecture of that without sacrificing the CPU cycles and memory that you have with garbage collection. Garbage collection sounds like it's a really ideal solution to the problem, but with incredibly limited memory, it's pretty easy to run into issues on Android. So I see this as a sort of like win-lose thing. So for iOS, it's really good for users because they get better performance with apps, but maybe a lose for developers if they don't have a memory management background. And then for Android, it's a win for developers, I guess, with Java background, but a lose for customers because apps aren't going to perform as well. Another different area that Apple approaches very differently to Android is with multitasking. And iOS 4 was actually the first version to support any sort of multitasking. Until this release, apps always launch from scratch, including most of Apple's built-in ones. iOS 4 allowed apps to keep memory contents available when the app was closed, so they could pick up where they left off, but they couldn't actually still run in the background with the CPU. Contents memory could still be terminated at any point, so you still designed your application like it's going to disappear whenever it felt like it. But over each successive release of iOS, Apple's continued to open up the functionality of multitasking and added new APIs. So for example, in iOS 7, they basically added a function where they give you a certain amount of CPU time where you can do something. Again, from iOS, I see this as a better experience for users because they don't have to worry about what's working in the background, but less flexibility for developers. But then on Android, it's a much worse experience for users, and some of the top apps on Android are task managers, which I don't think you should have to really worry about on your phone. Another big difference that's defined how the two competing OSs are represented in the market is their approach to screen size. Apple made a decision quite early on just to have one screen size but double the pixel density. And then with the iPhone 5, they increased the length of the display but didn't change the size of anything. For app developers, it made it really easy to produce high-quality graphical experiences, whereas compared to Android, graphics need to be scalable, which can result in them looking completely different on different sized screens. And when you're working with such a small range of pixels, it makes it really hard to get a really defined experience for the user. Again, I think Android has a win for consumer here with choice in device types, and some of the most popular Android devices are really big phones, particularly at the high end. But then a win for consumer on iOS with the quality of apps that are able to be produced. So while both Android and iOS have made improvements to the media APIs over the last few years, Android has had a much more focus on consuming content. It's really evident in a lot of their release notes, actually. Whereas Apple's APIs have had a real focus on creating content and exposing the APIs that they use in apps like iMovie over to developers. And if you look through the different app stores, the Play Store or the App Store, number of video editing apps on iOS compared to the number on Android, I think is a real testament to what the APIs that Apple are opening up are able to do. And then just to touch on a couple of things that Apple's changed in iOS 7. Obviously, they made some big changes to the user interface. But for developers, there are a big range of new APIs. They have an API for, it's a physics-based engine for any UI control, so you can basically add physics to anything. So you can add gravity to an object where it will just drop off the screen, and then you need to add bounds so that it'll actually bounce off something. And they've added things like inter-app audio, where apps can be audio filters from one app to another, as well as things like barcode recognition that use the camera really well and result in a really, really fast barcode scanning experience. So I think looking at this pace of change across the platform, there's clearly significant progress happening all the time. But I just want to then touch a little bit on where the business strategies fit in. Because often consumers seem to put Google and Apple against each other all the time. But I actually believe that both Apple and Google have very complementary business goals, and that the real competition often that we see as consumers is actually really between companies like Samsung and Apple. And often people that work in our industry, we go and look at the new products that Apple brings out and say that they're not innovative or boring, and then constantly every year Apple sells more units than they've sold before, and it's kind of where do these things match up? I think one of the most interesting numbers that Apple released recently was the 200 million upgrades to iOS 7 in under a week. From a developer's perspective, this means that we can launch a new app right now that is iOS 7 only, and almost all the apps now that we're actually working on are iOS 7 only. To put that in perspective, when we first started developing apps, there are less than 1 million devices, and only about 10,000 in New Zealand. And now the police have 10,000 devices. It's crazy. To contrast this with Android, with no new releases for approximately 6 months, 30% of devices accessing the Play Store running Gingerbread, which is now 3 years old, October 2010 I think, and 20% running Ice Cream Sandwich, slightly newer, and 44% running Jelly Bean. Unfortunately, what that actually means for users of those devices is that when designing an app, we're realistically writing for APIs that are now 3 years old. And I see this as a real win for iOS, as users have much more up-to-date software. So this means as developers we can use things like UI dynamics. And this is the sort of thing that I see as driving innovation for apps on the iOS platform. Apple builds a large number of new APIs into release, and then because there are enough users on the latest releases, we can actually take advantage of these straight away. We can compile for and take advantage of, say, the ARM64-based chip, whereas if Samsung launches a device, there's not actually much point in building something specifically for it because you don't even know which device is going to be popular this year. To contrast this with what Google are doing, compared to iOS with the OS updates, Google's now often actually providing their innovation in their software by updating the apps that sit on top of Android. And so from a developer's perspective, this means we have far less that we can reuse in terms of APIs. Google makes some of the libraries that they write backwards compatible and give you them that you can put into previous apps for targeting Gingerbread, but there's not really very many. So because of the nature of each of these companies' business models, they're being innovative in different places. So as users makes the platforms incredibly competitive, but as a developer, Apple has a much higher pace of innovation across the whole stack. And we see this with the number of popular apps that are always being developed first for iOS. It seems that Google doesn't almost care about third-party apps and only have them because it's necessary to be competitive. Google's core business is in search, and for every app that you don't use, you're using the web, which is obviously a key business driver for Google. So because of this, it's actually my belief that big innovation on Android from Google has passed. I'd love to be proved wrong with version 5 coming next year, and see Google make an OS that everybody can actually upgrade to, especially since they are the first by far to have over-the-air updates way before Apple. But it seems to me like Android's actually done the job that Google set out for it to do, which is to make sure there's a competitive smartphone with a good web browser. I think NFC is a really good example of how different the different ecosystems are. NFC's been around in Android now for a very long time, but it wasn't a feature that developers started using, and it's actually led to manufacturers with the latest Android devices and dropping NFC. Whereas compare this to Apple with iOS and the iPhones, they put a 64-bit chip in, and already, only a couple of weeks later, their apps are optimized for new architecture. So Google delivered a very innovative business model that is currently putting 150 million phones a quarter into people's hands, which is pretty awesome. And Google isn't really, I think, enabling the penetration of smartphone to reach 2 billion in the next couple of years. So within these phones there's a huge range of feature sets and huge variations in their OSs that they're running. But the one thing that is sure is they're all running a Unix-based OS, and they all have touchscreens, and they all have some way to connect to the internet. And that will change people's lives. The problem with this model is that it's not possible to release new software versions with new features for developers and end users, and have hundreds of millions of customers using them within a few weeks. And I think there's a real conscious trade-off that each company is making. Apple's operating model doesn't even enable them to sell 100 million units in a quarter. So as a developer, what this means to me is that when building software, we also have to make a choice. And so we can choose to build something innovative for iPhone users, But then on Android, because of the way the platform is developed, we need to make apps for either much older and less developed software stack or choose to only support premium new devices. To me, in the current battle to win the smartphone OS war, both Google and Apple are actually winning, as they're both executing their complementary strategies and they work well together. To conclude, Google doesn't actually care who wins because they're winning at their own game, which is a different game being played by the major competitor Apple. The losers in this current smartphone OS war are companies like BlackBerry and Nokia. So that's all I had to say. If anyone had any questions.
Questions, folks? Dumb silence, everyone wants to be.
What about Chrome?
In terms of smartphone OSs, well, do you know any smartphones with Chrome OS?
No, I don't, but it's not a Google operating system.
But I've been talking about things that people can go and buy in the hundreds of millions. So
Yeah,
I don't.
I was just wondering if you were speculate about what Google might be doing with Chrome OS versus Android. It's all right.
It's a good question. I don't know apart from anyone else at Google. They don't really make it very clear.
Okay.
Right on. Stopping the outtake.
Sorry, I can't hear. Can you go to the mic?
Not so much a question as an observation. It's not actually Google who are preventing people from upgrading to newer versions of Android. It's the OEMs, the phone manufacturers.
Yeah, which, however, in saying that, Google make the underlying operating system, and then they let OEMs customize it and change it to the point that it can't be upgraded. And at the end of the day, as developers, it basically means we can't make things for it, which is a bit unfortunate. Cool.
Okay.